God damn it! You kids get your butts out of here. Me and Roland are trying to have a talk. Roland added, an adult talk about stuff that don't concern you. He fixed the 4 youngsters with a stern eye and added, go check on the horses, or chop down a tree. Chris's suggestion came at the same time. Find us another fishing hole. Better yet, go wrestle each other and tell us who won. After you're done. Brandon, the archer, rose to his feet with a quiet chuckle. He knew what this talk would be about. I guess I'll see if any of them have any bowman material in them. In silence, Roland and Chris watched Brandon as he directed the 4 boys, then brazenly went to the 2 men's saddles and stripped the bows off the gear. Knowing he had their eyes on them, he lifted the instruments, then led Connor, Rory, Matthew, and Finn off, heading up the stream. Rusty, who'd been resting in the shade of a tree, rose to his feet and, with a glance at Chris, trotted after the youngsters. Roland snorted. Asshole. He could have at least asked. For a moment, Chris wondered who Roland was talking about, and then decided it was Brandon, not Rusty. Roland only concerned himself with the dog if Chris expressly asked. He poured a cup of coffee from the pot brewing on the low fire. Would you have told him? No? Yeah, me neither. The fresh grounds for the brew could be exchanged, straight across, for a couple full meals from one of the food stand ladies. Chris poured Roland a cup, and when he handed it to his best friend, he said, So, what's up with you and Ada? Roland sipped the hot brew carefully, then said, That friggin' Adam Whiteman. Just as soon as we left here, she was all over him, flirting with him the entire way down to that lake camp. Chris winced. That would be almost 40 miles of horseback, an eternity for someone watching his sweetie cozy up to another man. On the other hand, he could just imagine how Roland would have reacted. And what did you do? Roland bristled, looking over the rim of his cup. What could I do? I hung back and watched. Chris sipped his own cup, trying to put 2 and 2 together. His sister Ada had adored Roland since she was just 14. What would make her turn away from him? Thinking of Roland's scathing tongue, he said, You just watched? You didn't insult anyone? Didn't call anyone a pussy? Nobody was a dumbass or anything like that? Well, I dang sure didn't pretend I was happy about the way she was laughing with that Indian son of a bitch. Chris took a stick and stirred the embers of the fire, sending sparks into the air. His Tarins still responded to the flames, and he would just love to lose himself in them. But Frey Ma Tuk had healed him from that overwhelming urge, and now he just sat beside the small fire, enjoying the way it danced with the cooler air around it. Roland leveled a light slap at the side of Chris's head. Quit looking at the flames, moron. What do I do about your sister? Chris tore his eyes away from the enticing sparks and looked at Roland. Well, here's how I see it. If you want a woman who worships the ground you walk on, you better not pick Ada. She's a force of her own. She's young, she's pretty, and she knows what she's doing. The last is even more important now than it was before. Chris rubbed the bracers on his arms. Now that the days were getting warmer, the repurposed boot tops could get itchy. I don't need her to do all that. I just want her to be with me. Chris nodded slowly. She's been with you for years, Roland. He ran a hand over the scars across his brows and cheeks and added, Did she go home with Adam, or did she come to you? Under the brim of his cowboy hat, he glanced at his best friend. She's gonna get attention from all these other guys, and she's gonna like it. Hell, you and me, we both like getting noticed. That don't mean we're gonna fall into bed with whoever, and Ada's gonna be the same way. Roland got up and, instead of pouring himself another cup of coffee, retrieved the bottle of whiskey they'd packed in their cooler. He poured himself a jag, then handed the bottle to Chris. So, you think I should just get out of the way and let this thing happen? A strong gust of wind swirled flames up from their fire pit, overlaying the springtime song of the birds all around the little forest meadow. Indicating the darkening sky, Roland said, It looks like we might spend a cold, rainy night up here. After a pause, he added, And get your eyes off the fire again. Heaving a long, suffering sigh, Chris got up and went to retrieve the tarps from their pack. As they worked to tie them up between a few trees, Chris said, "If she is my girl, I'd pursue her. Everybody and their cousin is looking to steal her from you. Give her a reason to stay hooked to you." While they were situating the bedrolls, however, they heard a long bark coming from Rusty. The big dog loped across the green meadow, challenging a string of riders who emerged from the trail through the towering pines. The leader stopped, allowing Rusty to sniff them over, and called out, "Hello, the camp!" By the horses, Chris recognized the guards who'd come up with the 2 Idaho wagons yesterday, and he answered, "Come on in." As the riders entered the meadow and approached the camp, Brandon and the 4 boys came back from their target practice, curious about the visitors. With the wind and the rain strengthening, Chris and Roland invited the strangers to share their camp. Their own tarps were already hung, protecting the fire and a few good sleeping spots. A well-fed man in his 30s, Jonathan, accepted their invite, saying, "My boys are anxious to get to fishing. They're looking to hook some of that famous Jellystone trout. Some of us have never been up here, since the park is always so crowded with Turons and city folk." The Idaho men had brought 3 pack horses, their own, not borrowed from the Madison horse bunch, carrying their bedrolls and fishing gear. One was loaded entirely with clinking beer jars from the billing brewers and several bottles of spirits. These men were going to enjoy a good old fishing trip, just like they used to before. As they all worked together to unsaddle the horses and hobble them in the spring green meadow, many of the men studied Chris under the brim of their ball caps. Finally, storing the gear and throwing a tarp over it, one man said, "You're one of those weird sons of beaches. What's your trick? Making wind devils? Throwing dirt? Or making water flow uphill?" In the meadow where the wind had now finally brought the first few drops of ice-cold rain, several men were casting cautious looks at Chris and whispering to each other. He laughed softly. "Nope, I'm one of the guys who can throw fire around." Letting his Tarin rise, his scars became more pronounced, and his eyes filled with a familiar red glimmer. A flame sprang up from his one hand and turned into a small fireball. Keeping it steady against the wind gusts, he guided it to describe a lazy circle around himself before letting it return to his hand. As one, all the strangers continued to stare at Chris, until one of the youngest, a kid probably about 17 or 18, exclaimed, "Oh man, that is just dope! Just like in the movies!" Chris formed a couple more and gently juggled them, controlling each ball with precise accuracy. The kid reached out and tried to touch one of the flaming balls, but drew back with a loud, "Ouch! How are you not getting burned?" Showing off a little bit, Chris let the flame balls merge back into his hands rather than letting the fire dissipate over the windy meadow. "I don't rightly know," he lied. Looking at the rest of the men, he thought it might be wise not to explain too much. "It has something to do with the way the power went out during that snowstorm in December." While the younger men gushed about seeing X-Men and fire mages from some game, the older men drew away from him. The swirling, gusting wind brought snatches of their concerns to Chris. "That's not natural. Not of God," he heard from one man, while another one said, "We need these guys in our valley." But the one that showed Chris where these men stood was, "Do we really have to break bread with devil worshippers?" Roland retreated to Chris's side and surreptitiously gestured for Brandon to bring the boys back to the fire. When Rusty approached, the stranger's expressions became even more alarmed. Now that they were on the ground, the dog's unusual size confirmed him as a possible threat. Jonathan looked around at his men, some of the older ones still muttering under their breath. "On second thought, we better build our camp down the stream a ways. No offense, Tarin." The polite reply would have been to say, "None taken," but at that point, Chris would have rather chopped off his own arm than pretend to be cool. These men had come up from Idaho to trade with the Tarins of the Yellowstone Circle. They wanted, even needed, the powers the Tarins could wield. Yet here they were, after a 10-mile ride up the backcountry, and standing in the cold rain, the true feelings came out. The Tarins would be a necessary evil to maintain their way of life. Tolerated, maybe. He silently stood by their campfire, Rusty beside him, and stared at the Idaho men as they resaddled their horses and rode away down the creek. Roland took a sip from a bottle of beer, swiped from the other men, no doubt. "Bro, you might want to tone down your eyes a bit. You look like you're going to burn this whole meadow into a slag pit." He gave Chris a sideways smile as the other party disappeared behind a stand of cottonwoods. The rain had begun falling in earnest now, hitting their protective tarps with loud little plops, while the fire flared wildly in the strong wind. The 4 boys and Brandon had retreated to the warmth of their sheltered spot, and Rory asked, "Why are they leaving again?" "They just got here." All the boys' expressions were just a little confused, but no one answered them. A little while later, with the rain running off the tarps in constant streams, they ate the remaining fresh-caught trout, corn muffins, and wild greens. The horses stood with their tails to the wind, sheltering against the same little glade as the men. The boys had made a competitive game of dashing out into the rain, finding fallen branches in the dark, and chopping them up with the machetes they'd been given. They brought them back for Chris to dry, and, consequently, the fire was crackling, flaring high and warm. Brandon lifted the bottle the men had been passing around. "I think we should get out of here. Those Idaho guys are making a cold camp tonight. They won't be sleeping at all, with no fire in this rain. No telling what they'll decide to do in the middle of the night." Roland, of all people, cast a significant glance at the 4 boys as he slowly nodded. Chris scoffed loudly. "No way. I ain't letting them run us out of here." He ran his hand through Rusty's thick black and white coat. "You guys go and take the boys back home, but Rusty and me will stay." Roland took his black cowboy hat off and swiped a hand through his hair. "Where is the good pack of wolves when you need 'em? Or one of the man-crazy bears? They keep those guys busy for the night." He settled back down, his actions signaling his intention to stay. Brandon shifted in his heavy coat. "I was talking to one of those guys earlier, and they said that they didn't even run into one wolf on their way up here. But they also said that several big packs were all around the cities, Rexburg and Idaho Falls. They said the wolves are having a field day picking off travelers from there. The big grain bins are almost empty now, and the new harvest won't be in for another 2 months. No milk, no greens, no fresh food. A lot of people are leaving, trying to find better places to live." Roland nodded. "That's the way we heard it was in Cody. It's only the Mormons that are making it work, since they've been storing up food for their tribulation. And if you want them to share with you, you gotta join the church. But even the Mormons don't have as much stored up as they should. So people try to leave. And in the Cody area, a few guard troops banded together. If a guy can afford it, he can hire one of those crews to protect his family on the road." Chris stirred the fire with a stick and watched sparks rise up. He protected the fire from the dampness, but the blue tarp strung above it did most of the heavy work. "And nowadays, nobody knows how to ride a horse anymore. Even some of the ranchers went to using 4-wheelers before, and now it's hard to find enough bikes for a whole group of people wanting to move 200 miles. And then they're always restricted to the paved roads." He looked at Roland and Brandon and added, "Easy pickings for the wolves, or the cats, or bears. Pretty much like ducks in a barrel." When he saw the 4 boys sitting on the logs beside the fire, their eyes wide open, he indicated their bedrolls. "You boys should get to sleep. You don't need to hear all this doom and gloom." Roland laid a staying hand on Rory, the oldest one. "No, Chris, they do need to hear this. We took them up here so they could start learning how to ride. They gotta know why it's important." He turned to the kids and explained, "Most horses can do about 40 miles in a day, but then they need to rest. They can't do another 40 miles the next day. A really good horse will be able to take you for 70 or 80 miles, but again, they have to rest and recuperate. On the other hand, if you're using a bike, you can go a little bit faster, and if you are in really good shape, you can do it again the next day." He gestured at all the equipment they'd brought to make their camp. "But what if you have to move stuff, like our camping gear? We cross that big mountain coming up here. Would you have liked to pull it up here with a bike and a little bitty trailer behind it?" As the boys gave their understanding nods, Roland added, "Bikes are all fun and games until you gotta go off trail, or, heaven forbid, uphill for several miles." Brandon clapped a hand on Connor's shoulder. "There you go. That's why you have to learn to ride. Without power and electricity, the way things were before, you end up pretty helpless. That's why we got you up here learning some skills. And now, it's way past time for you kids to go to bed." Over the expected protests, Brandon and Roland herded the boys into their bedrolls, while Chris scanned the woods surrounding the meadow with his firesight. When he could not detect any movement, he checked Rusty, but the mutt lay close to the fire, stretched out in its warmth and sound asleep. Taking a seat on the log beside the fire, Brandon said, "You know those guys are going to try to sleep, but they'll be wet and cold. In about a couple of hours, in the deep of the night, they'll be sick of freezing and ready to do something about it." Grimacing, Chris shook his head. "We offered to share our camp. They didn't want to stay, so now that's on them." Brandon nodded. "Yep, that's right, but I don't relish the idea of sitting here all night and waiting for them to decide otherwise." Both Chris and Roland nodded. Neither wanted to be watching all night, on edge and expecting an attack. Brandon zipped up his heavy coat, pulling the collar high around his neck. "Hear me out, 'cause I think I got an idea." When the older man laid out his plan, Chris almost said he wouldn't do it. Only Roland's persuasion eventually changed his mind. And so it was that he and his companion snuck down the creek not much later. Thankfully, the rain was slowing down, yet their path through the deep grass along the creek bottom was still wet, leaving their boots soaked. Rusty paced ahead of them, his ears up and watching. Every time Rusty shifted his attention, Chris followed his eyes and ears, scanning the rain-soaked surroundings for the red and orange shapes his firesight would reveal. Yet they reached the other camp without interference. It was dark, and without even the light of a small lantern. As they paused their approach, Brandon whispered, "They don't even have a guard set. What are they thinking? We might not have seen any in weeks, but this is still wolf country." Roland replied, "Morons, dumber than a bunch of stupid sparrows." Still whispering, Chris indicated where he could see their thermal shapes. "We should just leave them alone. They wrapped up in a couple of tarps, and they ain't all that cold." But before he could turn away and retreat, Roland clapped a staying hand on his shoulder. Brandon whispered, "Just do what we came here for. Then we can go back and go to sleep." The look that accompanied the older man's words spoke volumes. Chris gave a long-suffering sigh, but located the pile of small sticks and branches laid out beside the sleeping men. He was supposed to ease the fire light, so as not to wake anyone, but as his Tarin chorused, he was caught in the exhilaration. With a loud whoomp, the bundle of wet sticks flared to life, hissing and then crackling loudly. The other men woke with exclamations and tried to scramble out of their sleeping bags, bringing their weapons to hand. Roland and Brandon charged towards them, their axes and long bowies at the ready. "Hold it! Easy now!" Gesturing with his axe, Brandon added, "We're only here to start your fire. We'll be gone in 1 minute." Rusty circled the men, his hackles raised and his razor-sharp fangs bared, a low growl rumbling in his chest. While Chris, both hands enveloped in the gratifying flames, stepped forward, ready to help his companions. Again, Brandon said, "Easy now. Just don't do nothing stupid." The young kid, the one who'd gushed about X-Men earlier, kept a close eye on the big dog, but courageously stepped forward, leaving his long machete low. "Thank you, Fire Mage. If I gather a few more pieces of wood, will your dog let me? That little pile of sticks right there ain't going to last very long." Chris gave a curt nod and spoke to Rusty as the young kid scrambled around the little stand of woods. In the dark, the kid had to feel his way around, but he soon came back with several fallen branches. When he threw them on, the thick, rain-soaked logs almost smothered the smaller blaze, but without turning away from the other men, Chris fed another flare at the pile. It lit up with another whoosh, then illuminated their camping area with hot, bright light. Roland pointed his heavy, long knife towards a couple of men. "You and you, help that kid gather up more wood. My buddy will dry it for you." When they returned, heaping it into an extra stack, Chris carefully burnt only the wetness away. It was a much harder task since he had to guide his burns so closely. When he was done, he looked up and saw several of the older men studying him with revulsion in their eyes. He returned their looks, glare for glare, then called Rusty to him, and without a word spun around to leave. Suddenly, one of the men stepped forward and called, "Fire Tarin, don't leave. You have the wrong idea about us." Chris stopped and, with a half-turned head, indicated he was listening, as Rusty circled around to face the other group. The Idaho man continued, spreading his hands in a gesture of peace. We are not against you. Well, most of us are not, he added with a cautioning look at an older man. We came here to trade, knowing full well who we'd have to deal with. He stepped forward and stretched out a hand. We all grew up with dreams of becoming someone like you. We play the video games and we watch the movies. X-Men, D&D, Guild Wars, Assassin's Creed, you name it. We wished for it all, but knew it could never happen. He shook his head, his expression filled with wonder. Only now it has. With his back still turned, Chris gave a solitary nod, an acknowledgement of the man's words, but nothing more. Then he left the other camp behind, fading into the darkness of the night. Roland cursed under his breath, but he and Brandon turned to keep up with him. After they'd gotten out of earshot, he said, Thanks a lot, bro. You almost left us hung out to dry back there. Chris snorted. For real? You don't think I could have turned and burnt those sons of bitches to cinders? Besides, you guys are here, safe and sound, and sloshing through this wet grass back to our camp. Under his breath, he added, And who's going to have to dry out your soggy boots when we get back to camp? Roland shrugged. Quit whining. You got to stay up and guard anyways, seeing you are the only one who can see the thermal shapes. You can sleep while we fix breakfast and gather up the horses. Chris sighed. Great. I won't even get to fish again. In the early afternoon of the next day, on their way back to the Madison camp, one of the little runner kids met them just a couple of miles east of the 7 Miles Bridge. The girl raced her little shaggy mount towards Chris and his companions, giving a small whoop of glee at finding them. They told us to find you, Mr. Focus, sir. They said it's important. So if you'll follow me, sir, the other Focuses are waiting for you to have their meeting. Chris wanted to say that he knew the way perfectly well. After all, it was just a few more miles down the blacktop road, but then he saw how eagerly she turned her pony. He handed the lead of his pack horse to Connor, who gaped and protested. But Chris, I don't know how to lead a pack horse. Chris laughed. You'll figure it out by the time you get back to camp. The girl already had a small lead on him, and he kicked his heavy bay mare into a long trot. The girl looked back and grinned, then flailed her sneakered feet at a red and white-colored gelding, and the two stretched out into an all-out run. Caught in the moment, Chris couldn't help but return the grin, and spoke to his mount, Come on, Lady Alice, let's see if we can't give those two hairy critters a run for their money. He caught up with his opponent easily enough, but seeing the look of determination on the girl's face and her sneakers still batting at the pony's sides, he slowed and allowed them to stay ahead. After about 2 miles, the pony started to tire, but valiantly tried to stay ahead of the much bigger mare. On they went for another mile, until the horse pastures along the river came into view. Buffalo grazed along the water's course now, looking for the lush green forage. One large horse bunch found their forage in the drier, stouter grass further up the mountainside. The horses, as well as the buffalo, lifted their heads in alarm as the girl and Chris came clattering along the blacktop. Suddenly, the little blonde-haired lass turned her pony left, up a slow incline that would lead them through scattered pines. He stopped, wondering what to do, but then decided the girl knew a shortcut, and that he'd let her have it. He put Lady Alice in a concerted run along the blacktop, the first time the big mare really stretched out. When he got to the spot where he thought the girl would emerge, he could see no sign of her. Had she already come down from the woods and crossed the road? Had she jumped one of the many deadfalls littering the forest, lost her seat, and gotten hurt? He scanned the road ahead for any sign of her, as well as the forested meadow to his left. Onward was a place where a steep, rocky hillside met the highway. The girl had to come out before that hard bluff, and he turned Lady Alice back. He'd hide behind a stand of woods and wait for her, but he just barely got into position before the two little fiends came bailing across the little clearing, riding hell-bent for leather. As the two clattered down the road, the little blonde-haired thing turned back and laughed at him. Then she turned down into the riverside to follow the trail there. As he followed her, old Alice loping along, he realized their two racing animals again spooked the grazers along the river. But with the girl just ahead of him, he pressed on, figuring he'd just deal with the pissed-off horse herders later. One of the mounted girls shouted, "Go, Charlie, go!" Blonde hair flying in the wind, the girl lowered herself against the neck of her pony, her sneakers again bashing against the little beast's sides. And, unbelievingly, her shaggy mount responded with another burst of speed. Big Alice's enjoyment in the race became evident, and she surged against Chris's guidance. She knew the goal line was just ahead, and she wanted to win. But then, the girl reined her pony into the waters of the river, silver drops splashing high with each stride. She emerged from the river, crossed a rocky outcropping, then descended into the river once more. Lady Alice, not as experienced as the pony, balked at the first crossing. No matter that Chris urged her to hurry, to regain speed, she slowly, carefully picked her way through the rushing water. And suddenly, Chris was truly being left behind. He urged Alice on and managed to persuade her into the river a second time. But by then, the 10-year-old on her little shaggy mount was already at the Madison house. She allowed the pony to stop, his red and white sides heaving, and lifted both her arms in victory. When he finally reached their goal, he offered the little blonde somewhat terse congratulations. It was one thing to let a little kid win. It was a completely different matter when you got your butt beat by a sneakered little girl on a hairy runt. The girl left, still laughing gleefully, no doubt to tell all her little friends of her victory. With a chagrined smile, he hobbled Lady Alice on the patch of grass right by the Madison building. There, Rusty found Vanna's otter right away, and the two started playing, while the Earth-focused buffalo grazed just below along the river's edge. Wynn's white eagle stooped on his roost beside the door, while this time JT's lavender buzzard soared high above. All the focuses were here, waiting for him inside. When he entered the building, JT looked up, reproach in his gaze. "Where have you been? We had to send out runner kids to find you." Chris didn't give an answer. It was none of their business, and he refused to apologize for taking a day to go fishing. Instead, he leveled a question for them. "We just had a council meeting a couple of days ago. What's the big emergency?" JT rose from his chair at the table and went to the cooler. Several jars of beer, made right here in the camp by the Billings brewers, bobbed in it amongst several uneven chunks of ice and water. He took a couple of jars, handed one to Chris, then opened the lid on his own. Chris nodded his thanks, then gave another nod to Vanna, who had, no doubt, provided the ice chunks in the water. The pretty woman stroked her black hair back, flashing a white-toothed smile at him, and he took a seat at the table between her and Travis, the huge native who was the Earth focus. Turning to Vanna, he said, "How's my sister?" Wind Rising, the Air focus, leaned forward to ask, "Yeah, Vanna, how is that girl? The whole camp heard a shouting match between those two a couple of nights ago." With a chuckle, Vanna reported, "I made her promise not to kill Roland." She paused theatrically, casting a look at Chris under her black lashes. "Let's just hope he behaves himself." Under his breath, Chris murmured, "Good luck with that." JT thumped his jar of beer on the table and said, "Are we done talking about the latest camp drama? This is what is most important right now. Last night, I finally managed to make contact with Spirit Tarin, who has been stuck in Cody for weeks. These are the images I received from her." The sketches he laid on the table, pencil drawn on paper, were stunning in their beauty, even as they depicted stark scenes. Chris recognized them as the work of a true artist. "These are the same types of pictures that are hanging on the bulletin board outside the store. You're the one doing those? Dang, dude, you are really good." Looking past the high skill level, he noticed all the men and women portrayed were Tarins, and they were all pictured inside a jail. Suddenly, he recognized one of the women, Jesselyn, the water Tarin who'd spent several weeks at the ranch before leaving again. She'd wanted to find her parents, who both still lived up in Park County. He couldn't imagine her getting into the kind of trouble that would get her arrested. Pointing at her image, he asked, "I've been thinking about her, but I thought she hadn't been here yet. How do you know her?" JT rolled his eyes, while Travis growled, "Dude, haven't you figured out anything yet? How do you think news from all around the world gets posted on that bulletin board? JT can speak to the other spirit focuses around the world. And the spirit Tarins, they can send each other those mind pictures. And you know he can influence people's moods, 'cause you keep bitching about it when he does it to you." Wynn snorted. Typical man. He was traveling with Megan for a couple of weeks and probably never thought to ask her anything. Too impressed with himself. While Native Lady's words stung, there was a strain of truth to them. On the way here, he had been occupied with himself. His Tarin had constantly surged against his controls, threatening to overpower him, to burn him to cinders in a fiery flash. Vanna leaned forward to hiss at Wind. "Shut up! You have no idea what it feels like when you overrun your Tarin. When I did it, I wanted to jump into every puddle and float away forever." She flashed Chris a smile as she quietly shifted a little closer. Chris looked at her with surprise. He had no idea she'd burnt through her talent, or how it happened. "I bet that's a story. What happened?" JT rapped his knuckles against the table, commanding their attention. "People! Hello!" Indicating Chris, he added, "You can flirt with a hot water chick some other time. How do we get our people out of that jail?" His face reflected his worry as he studied his own sketches, along with the maps laid out beside them. That bunch down in Cody acted very fast to nail down their power base. They might be hiding under the Mormon label, but actually, they're just a bunch of power-hungry sons of bitches who seized their chance. I know a couple of them, and if they are jailing Tarins on account of some Christian or Mormon commandment, they're only doing it to keep their people in check. He rubbed a hand through his lengthy black hair and added, "They ain't no shepherds, they're sharks." Chris adjusted the bracers across his forearms. He hadn't needed their protection in weeks, and sometimes they seemed a bit of overkill. But he liked the way the refurbished boot tops looked. How come they haven't been able to get themselves out? They're all Tarins. What's the holdup? JT looked at him directly. "You are the only one who knows one of them personally. You tell us." After a moment of contemplation, Chris said, "Jessalyn can only affect someone she actually touches, or water that is directly at her feet. She can't reach as far as most of us can." He paused, then added, "Maybe the other Tarins with her are the same." JT nodded his agreement. "I have been reaching for that spirit Tarin for several days. I was worried about her, seeing she hadn't moved in days. She might be weak compared to the rest of us, or maybe she hasn't figured out how to use her gift yet." He ran a hand over one of the images laid across the table. "It doesn't matter. She's very frightened, and we have to go get them." Chris slid Jessalyn's picture toward him. "Well, let's go then. You've been saying you want to send out teams. Let's each take a team, and then we'll teach those Cody sons of bitches not to mess with us." Travis laughed wryly. "You can't go with a team. None of us can. We are the focuses. We have to stay here to protect the tree and to tend to the Tarins who come to it." Chris leaned back from the table. "The hell I can't. All my Tarins are here. They've all gone before the mother and had their turn at the tree. I don't need to stay here." Vanna leaned towards him, and her black eyes met his. She tapped two of the picks on the table. "These two Tarins are mine. They still have to come here to gain acceptance. That one belongs to Wind, so she can't go either. JT has to wait for his spirit girl." Wind's voice rose above theirs. "None of us focuses can go. We are all consigned to protect the tree. That's the price of being a focus." Yet another restriction Chris hadn't agreed to, or was willing to follow. He returned Wind's scowl with one of his own, but wisely didn't say anything. More discussion about the rescue followed, but he only listened half-heartedly and gave his vote to their plans. He knew what he was meant to do. But first, there was something else he had to tend to. He went up to the camping spots and went to the RV that Brent and his posse occupied. As he'd thought, no one had bothered to make any effort to tidy things up. The same filthy blankets, discarded feed sacks, and broken boxes still littered the area. The bulldogs were still tied under the trailer, and by the look of things, they hadn't been fed since Chris had been here last. They rose to their feet and walked to the edge of their chains, not barking or sounding the alarm, but begging for food. Or maybe water. When he turned to tell Rusty to wait for him, he noticed Connor following as well. "I meant you gotta follow me tomorrow, not now." Connor shifted with an uneasy look. "I'll just follow you now, Mr. Firefocus, sir." Chris rolled his eyes. "All right. But quit calling me that. Just Chris. And stay here with Rusty. This is not going to be pretty." The kid's eyes went round, and he buried his hands in Rusty's thick coat. Chris nodded. Good. It looked like the kid understood. When he entered the trailer, he located each person, judging by their reactions what they might do, just as he had millions of times, as he'd handled cattle in the corrals, on a drive, or maybe during Brandon. The fire Tarins each had a pretty normie girl beside them, and somehow, even with the pleasant music coming from the two normies playing guitar and a low drum, the Tarins' voices seemed shrill in their boasting. The litter of crushed mushrooms covered the small table, and the smell of stagnant human sweat competed with the sharp stink of old ashtrays and spent cigarette butts. Brent Eagle, sitting in the kitchen nook's far corner, a jug of beer before him, looked up in surprise. But, as quickly as smoke dissipating in a stout Wyoming gust, his expression changed to contempt. Like mice running from the sudden appearance of the barn cat, the half-dressed girls fled the trailer, the two musicians immediately following. Two more low Tarins followed, jumping out the narrow door, only to turn around in the yard to watch. Ripping the flimsy table off its fastening, Chris threw it at the two mid-talented men, then threw himself onto Brent, took him by the hoodie, and pinned him against the RV's bench. Brent's eyes changed to red, glowing orbs, and the scars across his face became more pronounced as his Tarin rose. Then both his hands filled with flames, and with each defensive punch, he churned hot balls of fire over Chris. "You can't burn me, you moron! I'm a fire Tarin!" Chris growled. He shoved the other man back against the corner. With a look, he indicated the fires rolling up the RV's walls and gathering below the ceiling. "But you're gonna burn your own home! Again! For the second time in 3 days!" As the fire began to catch hold of the plastic and wood walls, the acrid stink of it filled the air. Brent's voice changed to a high-pitched panic scream. "Get him!" The first Tarin who tried to pull him away got Chris's elbow in his teeth, while the other one received a fully turned backhand to his nose. Both men recoiled and stumbled back, holding their faces, while Chris put his forearm into Brent's throat, lifting him up. The aimless flames caught hold of the plastic and wood inside the trailer, and with unstoppable certainty began to feed on themselves. Realization dawned on Brent's face. Heat, searing as that from a roaring wood stove, enveloped them, and Brent frantically tried to reach past Chris to take the fire into himself, to put it out. Growling in the native's face, Chris said, "Your house is on fire, and you're friggin' useless!" He pushed the man back and retreated a few steps. "You're on your own, jackass!" Brent's two friends stood just behind him, one holding a bleeding nose, while the other one fingered a split and bleeding lip. Turning to them, Chris said, "Now would be the time to wield your power, morons!" They looked at each other, puzzlement on their faces. Green as any kindergartner, the two men only knew how to start fires. Stupid Tarin tricks to impress the girls. Their faces had been marked by Frey Ma Took, the scars around their eyes fine white lines, proclaiming their innate power. Those marks drew desperate girls seeking strong men. But the Tarins only employed their talent for themselves, never to help anyone else. They were like TikTok warriors, looking for that epic pick that would get them all the attention. They were the ones who missed their phones and the internet the most. Now, with easy picks no longer available, they had to resort to bragging or cheap tricks in front of large audiences. Brent now scrambled around the kitchen nook, dampening the flames, but they had already grown too strong for him, and he was losing the battle. Chris scoffed. "You friggin' wuss! Come on! You want to be the fire focus. That all you got?" He turned to the others, a slight, light-haired young man with that wasted look of someone who'd lost himself to drink and drugs, and pushed him towards the flames. With scathing contempt, he growled, "I showed Brent how to do this 2 days ago, and he hasn't bothered to teach you?" He snorted. "That's the man who thinks he wants to be your focus?" Turning to the other one, a native who had definitely never let a plate pass him by, he gestured at the flames still rising at the walls. "Go help those two. Figure it out. Feel the resonance and read the flows. The sooner you get with it, the less damage you'll have to repair on your home." With all three of the men working, the fire was finally lessening. Suddenly, Brent groaned loudly, holding out his burning hands. Realizing the other man had taken up all the fire he could hold, Chris pointed at the open door. "Out! Throw it out into an empty spot and let it fly away into the air." Relief flew over Brent's face as he emptied the heat he'd gathered inside himself, and the stream of flames roared out the narrow door, where it dissipated into the clean mountain air. A sharp, high-pitched cry sounded outside, and Chris rushed to the door. Vanna and Ada had thrown themselves down in the face of the fiery blast, and now a layer of glossy water settled over them like fresh sheets on a bed. The bulldogs under the trailer barked and snarled at the two women, lunging against their chains, and Rusty left his post at the edge of the site to rush forward. He stood over Ada, his giant chest rumbling, and his dagger-long teeth bared at the other dogs. Vanna smoothly rolled to her feet, the water in her hair and on her clothes instantly drying, making a silver shimmer about her handsome shape. Chris's eyes drifted to Ada, though. With all the Tarins in this small space, his sister was as vulnerable as a baby amongst a pack of wolves. She spat water out, then wiped it from her face. As she tried to get up, her feet slipped twice in the fresh mud under her, until she grabbed a handful of Rusty's fur to steady herself. Large mud patches clung to her jeans and spattered her western shirt and cowboy vest, while her wet hair stuck to her scalp and face. She cursed loudly as she found her soaked cowboy hat and pressed it on her head. Vanna drew herself up, regal as a queen, the Terran scars across her face raised and distinct, while the blue in her eyes fairly glowed with power. She indicated the smoke escaping through the door and from one corner of the RV. "What in the hell, Chris? You think we got trailers to waste?" When she lifted her hands and he felt the Terran inside her rise once more, he held up a staying hand. "Stop, Focus. This is not your concern." Their eyes locked, both sets shimmering with their innate force, and she paused. He stepped towards her, the scars across his face feeling hot and swollen as he said, "These are my Terrans, Focus. Your water is not welcome here right now." She glared at him, but he felt her Terran subside, even though the scars around her eyes remained raised and threatening. Behind him, Brent pleaded, "Water, Focus! Vanna, please help us!" Chris returned her look, glare for glare. "Don't you dare." Vanna shifted her stance, then, with a last cautioning look at Chris, she retreated back into the littered campsite. She made a gesture indicating she would let him handle it, but the expression on her face warned him to have restraint. He indicated the other two fire Terrans in the yard and shouted, "Both of you get in there and help your fearless leader." Both men gaped at him for a moment, but then rushed into action. The smarter of the two climbed the ladder at the rear of the RV and took a hold of the flames from the top of the roof. The flares were already weakening, but his aid, executed correctly, lessened the damage to the trailer. Another fire Terran, a woman, came from the tents clustered around, towing a little boy by her hand. She asked Ada to watch the little kid, then stepped forward. "Focus, I think I can feel for heat pockets inside the walls." Chris nodded, trying to recall her name. Of the 40-plus fire Terrans he'd brought before Fremont took on his second day here, only 7 had been women. "Polaris, right?" She nodded, but with a last stay gesture at her boy, she didn't waste any time with pleasantries and began walking around the trailer. Soon, she pinpointed pockets of heat, called them to the Terrans inside, or dissipated them herself. Chris ordered all the Terrans to gather outside, and they picked their places carefully amongst the trash and rubble. "I told you to clean this place up 2 days ago," he gestured all around. "I told you to feed your dogs. Now, though, I can only feel 3 live dogs under the trailer. What happened to the 4th? 2 of his fire Terrans rushed forward, making loud yet useless exclamations. "Oh no, what happened? We fed them this morning, and they were all fine. We swear, Focus." He stood in the RV's doorway as the 2 checked on the dogs. One woman from the tents came forward and, with a loud, shrill voice, scolded her man. "You said you wanted to make spirit animals out of them, but you haven't fed Bruiser in days. I have, and I had to take food away from the kids to do it." She slapped on his chest. "And you never do anything with them. They just stay tied up under the trailer day in and day out. How will they ever become your spirit dogs? They don't even know you. Chris jumped down from his perch, asking, Spirit animals? Like Rusty and the water focuses otter? He scoffed. They're not spirit animals, not some mythical thing from your imagination. He pointed at his dog, still guarding both Ada and Connor. Rusty is with me, right here and right now, and he's free to do whatever he wants. With a gesture, he indicated the beautiful water focus. Same with Vanna's otter. He can do whatever he wants, but he chooses to help her. He shook his head, and memories ran through his mind. Clients arguing with his mother about how they wanted their horses trained, influenced by TikTok, Facebook, or YouTube shorts. He looked at his Tarins. You got it all wrong. You thought you knew what to do, but you picked the worst possible way to go about it. 'Cause you don't think you have to listen to anyone. Brent glared at him and began to argue, but Chris was in no mood to hear it. Your dogs are starving, man. One of them already died. Then he gestured around the camp. Fix your screw-up and clean up this camp. This campsite had better be clean when I come back in 3 hours. Ada and Vanna fell in at his side, and Connor materialized from somewhere close by. He'd obviously watched the whole thing, as his expression was pensive and maybe a bit nervous. Rusty paced beside the boy, bumped his shoulders against him, and lifted his nose to Connor's face. Only when he received a few pets across his heavy shoulders did he take off, nose to the ground, investigating the path. Ada smiled to see the big, glossy dog go, then said, Where are you going, Chris? With an ill-tempered shrug, he responded, I'm going to make sure they don't never do that again. Then he stopped in his tracks. Ah, hell, I don't even know those Tarins' names. Turning to Connor, he said, Run back up there, and one way or another, find out who exactly owns those dogs. As the boy hurried away, Chris called after him to meet him down by the store. Entering the store, he asked for paper and a Sharpie to write his message. Ignoring the traffic of people looking for flour, vegetables, and dairy products, he scratched out his message. He started with, The Focus Council will not pay Brent Eagle's debts. Vanna gasped. How can you say that when you haven't talked it over with us? Chris scoffed. He tried to kill me with his flames, but I survived because I'm stronger and have more experience. Now his RV is destroyed, and he'll have to rebuild it. He's a Tarin. The council provides for all the Tarins. He'll come to us to get new supplies, or even a new RV. He took his cowboy hat off, rubbed at the itching scars across his brow, then replaced it. Nah, let him face real-world consequences. He can pay or trade his work for the materials he'll need to fix his mess. He signed it, Fire Focus Chris Richter, then tacked the sheet up on the bulletin board. Taking another clean piece of paper, he wrote, These 4 Tarins have abused, starved their dogs. Do not sell, trade, or give them another animal. Just thinking about the dogs under that trailer made him fume with rage. Impatiently, he waited for Connor to return and provide names for his message. But then he put down the one that he actually knew, Brent Eagle. Vanna scowled at him. You come to the council meetings, and you keep telling us you don't want no part of them. Now here you are leaning on your focus calling to pass judgment, to help you control your Tarins. You can't have it both ways, boy. Either you are part of the council, or you're not. She paused and shook her head. Either you are the focus the mother has called, or you're not. Choose. But until you do, you can't post these kinds of messages on the bulletin board. Remembering the sorry dogs tied under that RV, he slid past her angrily. Stay out of my way, Vanna. I'm doing this. And he impatiently tacked the other sheet up. He would add the names when the kid brought them, but deep inside, he knew she had a point. And he knew he would have to accept his job in this community. Who else was there to do it? Brent Eagle? No, the job was his. Someone had to run the shoot on this bunch of fire Tarins, and he was the one who could. So he would. Begrudgingly, he nodded at the sleek lady. I won't bitch about the council no more. Connor soon brought back 3 more names, and Chris scratched them below Brent's. Ada hissed loudly as she examined the sheet posted along with the other announcements, news bits, and work schedules. That's harsh, Chris. Chris gave a grim nod. What else am I going to do? Write them a ticket? Tell the cops there's some animal rescue? I haven't noticed jail around here, so... He spread his hands. Besides, it'd be on us to feed them in the lockup, and I don't imagine anyone would like that. Ada grimaced, but her face said she agreed. But this is a public shaming. You might as well build a set of stocks and put them in it. Chris laughed. Tempting. Yeah, that would work, but how about we try this first? Telling Ada and Vanna that he would meet them later, Chris and Connor, followed by Rusty, went down to the horse lines. He had to make sure Big Alice had been turned loose, and that his saddle had been put upright. There he found Roland, Brandon, and the other boys, as they finished turning the horses they'd used for their camping trip loose. Smirking through his short black beard, Roland asked, Did you really let that blonde girl and her Barbie horsey beat you in your little race? Chris hung his head, then took his cowboy hat off and combed his sandy brown hair back. Putting it back on, he screwed it down tight over the line of scars over his brow. Well, I meant for her to win. I just hadn't planned on letting her tromp my butt in the dirt. Putting his saddle on one of the racks, Roland guffawed. Bro, that is just too good. Beaten by a 10-year-old riding My Little Pony? The horse girls were watching as they saddled their night watch mounts. Chris could see them trying to hide their grins as they listened to Roland's teasing. Chris sighed loudly. He would never live this down. Let's just change the subject, okay? He led Roland away, out of the girl's earshot, and said, I need your help, bro. We're leaving again tomorrow, heading down to Cody. Jesselyn is being held up in the county jail there. He rubbed his fingers over the itching Tarins scars across both cheeks. The council has some harebrained idea about getting her and the others out of there, but I don't think that's going to work. You, Ada, and me. We're going to go after her. What the hell are you talking about? Jesselyn? Our Jesselyn? How in the world did that girl end up in jail? While Roland put his saddle on a rack under the tent, Chris explained the messaging that spirit Tarins could use. Arranging the cinches and straps neatly, Roland answered, We're definitely going to need one of those guys then. And remember the air Tarin working with the rock Tarin down at the horse ranch? Yeah, we could use that combo for sure. What? No, it's just going to be you and Ada and me, like we've always done it. Roland shook his head. What do you mean, like we've always done it? Usually, we have your dad and my dad and your mama with us. And Tough and Letty? No, we're not doing this all alone. Especially not with all these good hands around. He looked at Chris as he hung his bridle on a hook. Oh, I get it. Get what? Chris said, as he watched the 4 boys turn their mounts loose to graze. Roland gave a wry chuckle. Your dad. He was like this, back before. He always came over to help. All we had to do was ask. But when you guys needed help, he smiled at Chris. My dad had to guess. Lowering his voice to imitate trends, he added, Roland, why don't you take the front end loader over to the Richters today? I bet they could use it. Chris chuckled as he remembered that particular incident. Yeah, I was never so glad to see you coming. Dad had us out there with picks and shovels to build a few low dams across the draws, and it was almost 100 degrees. Roland imitated the easy hand motions used to control that machine while he aped the sound of a loader. When he spread his hands in an all-done gesture, he added, Leave it to me, bro. I know a few guys that wouldn't mind playing hooky for a few days, and we'll hunt on the way back, make your bunch of big shots happy. Brandon moved closer then. I heard playing hooky and hunting. Can I come? Roland chuckled. Hell yeah, come on. I'll clue you in while we gather up some more people. As the 2 walked away, Chris's eyes fell on the 4 boys. They were standing far enough away not to be noticed, but close enough to have heard the discussion. I suppose you kids want to come as well? Flynn, the leader of that little group, nodded. We sure don't want to stay here with our mothers. Chris sighed. The boys would add almost useless cost to the trip he was planning. All right, but Rory, you will be Roland's helper, and Flynn, you will stay by Brandon's side, and Matthew, you will do whatever Ada tells you. If she tells you to stand on your head and dance, that is exactly what you will do. And Connor, guess who you will be following? The teen answered, You, Mr. Firefocus, sir? This was a story from the Wyoming Tarin Rising series, and we want to thank you sincerely for listening. Please, press that like button now, seeing that'll help the vid and the story get recommended for others. Besides, nothing makes a person's day more than seeing those likes. This part was called Wyoming Tarin's Rising, Lessons in Reality. It was narrated by Josh C. Williams and written by Ashakery Dart. It is copyrighted for January 29th, 2026. And we want to thank our editor, Victoria Stormson. Hopefully, we'll have another one ready for you soon, so be sure to subscribe and check for updates.